The match flared in his hand, and for a moment the cellar held its breath. Holt Hartwell sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, with a sealed envelope balanced on his knee, and the candle he had just lit threw a small orange circle of light across walls that had not seen flame in 65 years. The wax of the seal was the color of dried blood. The paper of the envelope was the color of old wheat, and the handwriting across the front, in long, careful strokes that belonged to a generation that learned penmanship in one-room schoolhouses, read 7 words that he had read 40 times in the last hour and still could not quite believe. To whoever carries the Hartwell name forward. The candle bent in a draft that had no business existing in a sealed chamber. He cupped his hand around the flame. From somewhere above him in the dark country, quiet, a barn owl called once and went silent. And the orange tabby cat that had walked beside him for 3 weeks now, who had no business being underground either, settled against his hip with the soft, assured weight of a creature that had decided completely and without explanation that this was where it belonged. Holt's thumb hovered over the wax. He was 20 years old. He had been homeless for 2 of those years. He had $5 to his name when the auction started that afternoon, and he had 4 left when it ended, and he was about to open a letter that a man he had never met had sealed inside the foundation of a stone tower that should not exist in a county that nobody famous had ever come from. But to understand how a boy with nothing came to sit on the foundation of a 139-year-old cathedral of stone on a Tuesday in September, holding a letter from a dead man whose blood ran in his own veins, you have to go back 3 weeks. You have to go back to a stretch of highway in western Iowa, where a Honda Civic gave up its life on the shoulder of Route 30, and a young man with nothing in the world stepped out of it with the quiet, gathered calm of someone who had run out of places to fall. Has there ever been a road you walked because there was no other road left? The Civic made a sound like a cough, then a rattle, then nothing at all. Holt guided it onto the gravel shoulder and turned the key twice. The engine answered with the dry silence of something finally and permanently done. He sat for a moment with both hands resting on the wheel, watching the September light spread thin across cornfields that ran flat and gold all the way to a horizon he could not see the end of. He did not curse. He did not hit the dashboard. He had used up that kind of motion years ago, back when there was still someone who might come pick him up if he called. There was no one to call now. The prepaid phone in his pocket had been out of minutes for 4 days, and the duffel bag in the passenger seat held everything he owned, which was not much. He reached into the glove compartment and took out the only thing inside it. A small olive green tin box dented on one corner, the kind that had once held cough drops in a drugstore in the 1950s. Inside the tin, wrapped in a square of muslin, gone soft as flour, was a pocket watch on a worn brass chain. The case was scratched. The crystal was hairline cracked. On the back, engraved in a script so fine it took a magnifying glass to read it properly, were the letters J.H. in the year 1882. His grandmother Opal had pressed the tin into his hand the week before she died, when he was 14 and did not yet understand that some objects carry the whole weight of a family in them. "Keep this for me," she had said, and her hand had been cold and dry around his, and her eyes had been a steady gray-brown that did not look away even at the end. "Don't sell it. Whatever happens, don't sell it." He had not sold it. He had slept in shelters and back seats, and once for 3 weeks in a laundromat that left its door unlocked at night, and he had been hungry more times than he could count, and twice he had stood at a pawn shop counter with the tin in his pocket and walked back out without taking it from his bag. The watch had stayed with him because Opal had asked it to. He put the tin into the inside pocket of his jacket, now against his ribs, where he could feel its small, steady shape, and he opened the car door and stepped out into the wind. The wind in Iowa in September carries the smell of corn drying on the stalk and diesel from the grain trucks miles away. It carries the absence of any nearby city. It carries the size of the sky, which is a thing you can feel against your skin in country that flat. Holt stood beside the dead car for a long minute and let the size of the sky settle on him. He was lean the way young men are when they have been running on resolve more than calories. 5'11", wiry through the shoulders, carrying the kind of functional strength that came from 2 summers of unloading delivery trucks for cash under the table. His hair was a dark auburn brown that he had cut himself with kitchen scissors in a shelter bathroom 3 months back, and it had grown out enough to fall across his forehead in the wind. His eyes were a quiet, dark hazel green, the green more visible in some lights than others, and they had the steady attention of someone who had learned young to read a room before stepping into it. A thin, pale scar ran across the bridge of his nose, where he had taken a fall on a slick fire escape stair at 16. He wore a soft gray cotton Henley with the collar stretched and the sleeves rolled to mid-forearm, and over it a faded dark green canvas work jacket that had been his grandmother's husband's before it was anyone else's. The denim of his jeans had gone pale at the knees. His boots were brown leather, well worn, and the toe of the left one had a small split he kept meaning to glue and never did. He pulled the duffel from the passenger seat. He locked the car out of habit, although there was nothing in it worth taking, and he started walking east along the shoulder. A green sign 200 yards on read Colton 4. He had never heard of it. The afternoon stretched. The sun fell slowly. He walked past a half-empty cattle lot, past a long curve of split-rail fencing that needed mending, past a single white farmhouse with a wind chime on its porch and no car in its drive. The chime made a small, clear sound as he passed, and a dog barked twice from somewhere behind the house and then stopped. He kept walking. About a mile out from the town line where the highway dipped through a stand of cottonwoods and the asphalt gave way briefly to old patched concrete, he saw a gas station with a single pump and a glass door propped open with a brick. The sign said, "Pump and Pick," and the paint on the sign had faded to the color of dust. Holt counted the bills in his pocket. $62. He went in and bought a bottle of water and a ham sandwich wrapped in plastic, and he came back out and sat on the curb beside the pump to eat half of it. That was when the cat appeared. It came around the corner of the building, the way cats come without announcing itself, without hurry, as though it had always been there, and you had just now noticed. It was lean the way the boy was lean, the wiry, compact build of a young Tom who had been living rough and learning the rules of it. Its coat was a warm, burnt orange short, and dense with darker tabby stripes running clean across its ribs and shoulders and curling around the long tail like the rings on a tree. There was a dark M-shaped marking on the center of its forehead between the ears, the kind that catechism teachers used to call the mark of mercy in old farm country. Its chin and chest and belly were a soft cream white that caught the late sun. Its left ear was notched at the tip from some old fight it had won or lost. A small pale scar crossed the bridge of its nose. Its eyes were a round, wide gold amber, and they were looking directly at Holt without blinking. It sat down 4 feet from his boots. It did not approach. It did not look away. He held the sandwich still for a moment. Then he tore off a piece of the ham and he set it down on the concrete between them, and he leaned back against the gas pump and waited. The cat watched the ham. The cat watched the boy. After a slow count of 15, the cat stepped forward, sniffed the meat, picked it up in its small white teeth, and ate it with the efficient calm of a creature that had not eaten in 2 days and did not want anyone to know. Holt tore off another piece. He set it down a foot closer. The cat ate that one too. By the time the sandwich was gone, the cat was lying with its forelegs tucked under its chest, 2 feet from Holt's boot, and the M on its forehead caught the light each time it tilted its head, and a low, rusty motor of a sound had begun in its small rib cage. A purr that sounded as though it had not been used in a long time. "Where do you live?" Holt asked. His voice came out softer than he expected. He had not used it for a real conversation in 11 days. The cat blinked once slowly. It did not have a collar. It did not have anything. Holt looked at it for a long minute. He thought of all the reasons he should walk away and leave the cat there in front of the pump and pick. He had no food for it, no carrier, no money for a vet. He could not even take care of himself properly on any honest accounting. But the cat had stopped, and so had he. 2 creatures on the same shoulder of the same Tuesday, neither one going anywhere in particular, both of them out of road. "All right," Holt said quietly. "All right then." He stood up. He shouldered the duffel. He started walking again toward the town line, and after about 10 paces he turned around to look. The cat was following him. Not at his heel like a dog, but in the way cats follow 20 feet behind, taking its own line through the grass at the edge of the shoulder, disappearing for a stretch, and then reappearing further on, never quite letting him out of its sight. Holt watched it for a moment. Then he kept walking. He named it before they reached the town line. He did not know where the name came from, except that the cat moved like something that had decided to stay close, without being held, and the color of it in the afternoon light reminded him of the rust on the chain of his grandfather's pocket watch. "Rusty," he said aloud, testing the sound of it. The cat flicked its notched left ear. "Rusty it is." The town of Colton came into view a quarter of an hour later. He saw the church steeple first, the way you always see church steeples first in country towns. Then a grain elevator, the color of bone. Then the slow appearance of rooftops and a few storefronts and a stoplight blinking yellow over Main Street, the way stoplights blink yellow in small Iowa towns after 6 on a weekday. And then he saw the tower. He stopped walking. It rose out of the cornfields east of town, the way a cathedral rises out of a wheat plain, wrong, somehow monumental, impossible for the place. It was built of pale limestone, the color of old bone, and it climbed 180 feet into a sky-going copper at the edges, and it stood not on a round base, but on an octagonal one, 8 broad walls of cut stone laid by hands that had known what they were doing more than a century ago. Halfway up the shaft were arched windows in the Gothic style, tall and narrow with stone tracery like the petals of a flower. Near the top where the shaft narrowed, there was what looked like a small lantern room, a glass and stone chamber circled by a stone walkway, the kind of thing you saw on lighthouses on the New England coast or on the church towers of European villages in old movies. And above the lantern room, where a spire had once climbed to a finishing point in the sky, there was now only a jagged break of stone. The top 30 feet of the tower had snapped off in some recent storm and lay in a great rubble field around the base, like the broken bones of a giant. What remained was still taller than anything else in 3 counties. What remained looked from where Holt stood on the highway's shoulder like a pair of stone hands raised palm to palm toward the sky. He stood there with a duffel on his shoulder and his lips slightly parted, and he could not for a long minute move. Rusty came up beside him and sat down on his boot. A pickup truck passed on the road behind them and slowed. The driver, a man in a green seed corn cap, leaned out the window. "First time seeing the praying tower," he called. Holt nodded without taking his eyes off it. "Built in 1887, the man said. Some Hartwell fella did it. Stone cutter all the way from Bavaria. Used to be the tallest thing between Des Moines and Omaha. Top come off in the storm of 18. He spat out the window. "Town don't go near it. Folks say it's bad luck. You staying in Colton." "Just passing through," Holt said. The man looked at him a moment longer, took in the duffel, the worn boots, the cat sitting on the stranger's foot. He did not look unkind. He looked the way Iowans look when they are deciding whether to ask a question. He decided not to. "Auctions at the courthouse," he said instead. "Started at 4. They're selling lots from the county surplus list. If you're looking for something cheap." "Thanks," Holt said. The truck pulled away. Holt looked down at Rusty. Rusty looked up at him. The M on the cat's forehead caught the last of the daylight. "Auction," Holt said. "Let's go see." He kept walking. The courthouse sat at the end of Main Street, brick and stout, and built in the 1920s with the kind of stone trim that small county seats put up when small county seats still believed they would matter. The auction was being held in the side parking lot. Maybe 40 people had gathered on folding chairs in front of a flatbed trailer where the auctioneer stood with a clipboard. Pickup trucks were parked all along the curb. The light had gone gold and slanted the way light goes in late afternoon in September in country that flat. Holt drifted to the back of the crowd. Rusty climbed up onto the low brick retaining wall at the edge of the parking lot and lay down along the top of it, like a small orange punctuation mark, the notched ear backlit, watching everything. Lots came and went. A John Deere mower from 1982 went for 220. A pallet of cinder blocks went for 40. A horse trailer with a soft floor went for 80. The auctioneer worked fast, easy in his rhythm, joking with the crowd. The bidders were mostly older men in caps and a few women in vests, the kind of people who had lived in Colton long enough to know what was worth bidding on and what was not. Lot 14, the auctioneer said, and his voice shifted into something almost amused. He held up a clipboard and read from it. Half-acre parcel, east edge of town, site of the old Hartwell stone tower. A small ripple moved through the crowd at the name. Parcel includes the surviving structure, all storm debris, and whatever bats and barn owls have decided to call it home since 2018. He grinned. Folks, you know what this is. Tower come down in the storm 7 years back. County's been carrying it on the books ever since. Historic register tag means we can't knock the rest of it. Nobody's wanted it. Starting bid $5. Nobody moved. The auctioneer laughed. $5, friends. You spend more than that on a Coke and a hot dog. A man in the front row called out, Bad luck, Pete. Praying Tower's haunted. A woman in a green vest said, $5, the auctioneer said again. Going once, going, $5. The voice came from the back of the crowd and was quieter than the auctioneer had been speaking, but in the silence between his sentences it carried. Every head in the parking lot turned. Holt felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes settle on him at the same moment. He felt the wind move through the cottonwoods at the edge of the lot. He felt Rusty's gold-amber stare from the retaining wall. He felt the small dented tin against his ribs with the pocket watch inside it with the initials J.H. and the year 1882 engraved on the back. He did not know yet, standing there with his hand in his pocket on a $5 bill, that those initials belonged to the man who had laid the first stone of the tower he had just bid on 139 years before. He only knew that he had nowhere to sleep and that a half-acre with a fence around it was on the math of his life a better deal than the highway shoulder. The auctioneer looked at him for a beat longer than was professional. Then he raised the gavel. We have 5. Do I hear 10? The silence held. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a small, clean crack. Sold. Lot 14 to the young man at the back. See the clerk for your paperwork, son. A few people clapped the way you clap at the end of a joke. A man near the front shook his head. A woman in the green vest crossed herself almost without thinking about it. Holt walked up to the front. He pulled the $5 bill from his pocket. His hand was steady, his eyes were dry. The county clerk was a woman in her mid-60s with steel-rimmed reading glasses on a thin silver chain and silver blonde hair pulled back into a low practical knot. Her name tag read, I, Cassidy. She took his $5 and she did not laugh, and she did not shake her head the way a clerk might have at the rest of those lots. She opened a folder and laid 3 forms in front of him and uncapped a pen. Name, please, she said. Holt Hartwell. Imogen Cassidy's pen stopped moving above the paper. It did not jerk. It did not tremble. It simply stopped for the length of one slow breath, and her pale gray eyes lifted from the forms to his face, and she looked at him the way a person looks when she has just heard a name she has been waiting most of her life to hear. Hartwell, she said. Yes, ma'am. She held his gaze a second longer. Then she lowered her eyes to the paper and resumed writing in handwriting, so even and careful it looked typed. Spell it for me, she said quietly. He spelled it. She finished the forms. She slid them across the counter one by one and pointed at each line for him to sign. She handed him a folded property deed in a manila envelope. Her hands did not shake, but he noticed when she passed him the envelope that she held onto her end of it for half a second longer than she needed to. East on Maple, she said. Past the grain elevator. Right on Tower Road. You'll see it from the highway. She paused. You'll definitely see it. Thank you, Holt said. She looked at him a moment longer. The afternoon was leaving the parking lot now in long gold bars. Somewhere across town, a church bell rang the half hour. Mr. Hartwell, Imogen Cassidy said, welcome to Colton. He walked out of the parking lot with the deed in his hand and Rusty falling in 20 feet behind him along the curb, and he did not know what he had just done. The walk to the property was about 3/4 of a mile. He went east on Maple, as the clerk had said, past a brick library with geraniums in the window boxes, past the grain elevator that smelled of dry corn, and then right onto a dirt road that ran out between two cornfields toward the rising bone of the tower against the eastern sky. The land was bigger than he had expected. A half-acre sounds small until you walk it. The lot was surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence with a gate that hung open on one hinge, and the gate posts leaned the way old fence posts lean in country where the wind never stops. The grass inside the fence had grown waist-high in some places. Wild sunflowers leaned against the fence line. A few scraggly volunteer apple trees had taken root near the back corner, their fruit small and sour-looking on the branches. And at the center of all of it stood the tower. He had seen it from the highway. He had seen it from a mile out. Standing inside the fence with the property deed in his hand and the cat at his ankle, he saw it for the first time the way the people who built it must have seen it. The octagonal base was vast. Each of its 8 walls was 12 feet wide, faced in pale limestone, fitted so cleanly that he could not slide a fingernail into the seams between blocks. The walls climbed without break for 40 feet, plain and bone pale, and then opened into the first ring of arched windows. Tall lancet windows with stone tracery, 4 of the 8 still intact, 4 broken, opened by the storm. Above the windows, the shaft narrowed and rose. A second ring of openings, smaller decorative, ringed the tower at the 80-foot mark. At the 120-foot mark, the lantern room sat like a small chapel. Hung in the air, its stone walkway still attached, 3 of its 4 glass panels gone. And above the lantern room, the broken edge of the shaft jagged where the spire had gone down. The fallen spire itself lay in pieces around the base in a great rubble field of cut limestone blocks. Some of them as large as a refrigerator, some as small as a loaf of bread. All of them dressed and shaped by hand 139 years ago. In the center of the rubble field, exposed where the spire had punched through it on the way down, was the original foundation of the tower. A great circular concrete pad 20 feet across, ringed by the bottom course of limestone with rusted iron anchor bolts, still standing in the perimeter. The concrete was dry and unbroken. It looked in the failing light like the surface of a well covered over. Holt walked slowly across the rubble field toward it. His grandmother had been a quiet woman. She had never spoken about Iowa. She had never spoken about a place called Colton, or a tower made of stone, or a name like Hartwell that was somehow also his own. She had raised him in a third-floor walk-up in a city far from here, and she had worked 2 cleaning jobs to keep them fed, and she had taught him how to thread a needle, and how to caulk a tub, and how to walk into a room without making yourself a target. She had given him almost nothing in the way of family history. She had given him only the pocket watch in the dented tin box in her hand at the end, and her steady gray-brown eyes, and the instruction not to sell. And now he stood inside a fence in a town he had never heard of, on a half-acre of land that was somehow legally his, in front of a stone tower with windows like a cathedral, and the wind across the cornfields smelled of something he could not name. Something he could not have a memory of, and yet did. Rusty hopped up onto one of the smaller fallen blocks of limestone, the M on his forehead bright in the last of the light, and sat down to watch him. The first night, Holt slept under a tarp he strung between 2 of the larger blocks of fallen stone, with his duffel as a pillow and his grandmother's husband's jacket pulled around his shoulders against the September chill. He ate the rest of the gas station sandwich. He drank half the bottle of water. He kept the rest for morning. He did not light a fire because he did not want to draw the attention of the town any sooner than he had to. He lay on his back on the cold concrete pad of the foundation, Looking up at the sky, and the stars came out in numbers he had not seen in 2 years of city sleeping. The Milky Way crossed the sky like a chalk line. The tower rose against it black and silent and immense, and Holt looked up the long, pale spine of it until his eyes ached. He thought of his grandmother. He thought of the way she had said, "Don't sell it, whatever happens." He thought of the look in Imogen Cassidy's gray eyes when he had said his name. And then, because he was 20 years old and homeless and had spent his last $5 on a tower he did not understand, and because there was no one to see him and no shelter monitor to write it down and no foster care worker to mark him difficult, for the first time in many months, Holt Hartwell cried. Not loud, not for long. A few slow tears that ran down the sides of his face, into his hair, and were absorbed by the rolled cotton of his jacket collar. Rusty padded across the concrete with the soft, sure step of a cat that had decided. He climbed up onto Holt's chest, settled his weight there, as though he had measured it, and tucked his front paws beneath himself. The notched ear caught the moonlight. The M on his forehead disappeared into the dark of Holt's jacket. The rusty motor in his small ribs started up. Holt put one hand on the cat's warm back, and he kept it there, and he did not cry anymore. Above them, the broken tower rose into the stars. The next morning, he was awake before the sun. He drank the rest of his water. He took stock. He had $57 left. He had a duffel bag with 3 changes of clothes in his grandmother's tin box and the property deed in its manila envelope. He had a half-acre of weeds and rubble. He had a cat. He started to work. He did not know what else to do. He had spent most of his life learning that, when nothing makes sense, you put your hands on the nearest broken thing and you move it. So he began at the gate, pulling weeds that had grown through the chain link, stacking them in a pile by the fence. He worked steadily through the morning, the dark green canvas of his jacket draped over a fence post. The sleeves of his Henley rolled to his elbows. The scar across the bridge of his nose burned a little in the wind. His hands learned the shape of the work. By mid-morning, a pickup truck slowed on Tower Road and pulled over. A woman climbed out. Late 60s, maybe 70s, silver hair, cut short and practical, a canvas apron over a blue button-down shirt. She walked across the rubble field toward him with the kind of step that did not waste motion. She carried a gallon jug of water in one hand and a paper bag in the other. "You the one who bought it," she said. Not a question. Holt straightened. He wiped his palms on his jeans. "That's me. Winona Harkness." She held out the water jug. "I run the hardware store on Main. People notice when somebody's been working out here without a hose hookup for 12 hours. Brought you this." He took the jug. His throat tightened in a way he was not expecting. "Thank you, ma'am." Winona looked around the lot, taking in the cleared strip along the fence, the small organized pile of weeds, the duffel under the tarp. "You been at this since dawn." "About that." She nodded once as though she had confirmed something she had already guessed. Then her eyes went past him to where Rusty was lying on top of one of the limestone blocks, sunning himself with the M on his forehead clearly visible, and the notched left ear flicked toward her. "He yours? He came with me." Winona looked at the cat a moment longer. Then she looked back at Holt. Her eyes were the kind of pale blue that gets paler with age. They had a long, quiet attention in them. "What's your name, son?" "Holt." "Holt what?" He hesitated. He did not know why. The clerk's face yesterday came back to him, the way she had stopped writing. "Hartwell," he said. Winona Harkness did not move for the length of one breath. She held the paper bag against her hip, and she looked at him, and her eyes went very slowly from his face to the dark green jacket draped over the fence post, and back to his face, and then up the long, pale shaft of the broken stone tower above them. "Hartwell," she said softly, "I'll be." She handed him the paper bag without taking her eyes off him. Inside was a ham sandwich on white bread, an apple, and a pair of leather work gloves. "I'm sorry," Holt said. Do you know that name?" Winona Harkness looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she looked up at the tower again, and the wind moved her short silver hair, and she said in a voice gone quieter than before, "Son, this whole town knows that name. We just haven't said it out loud in 65 years." She turned and walked back to her pickup truck before he could ask her what she meant. She climbed in. She started the engine. She rolled down the window and called across the rubble field. "You come by the store this afternoon. I'm running you a tab. Don't argue." The truck pulled away in a small cloud of September dust. Holt stood with the paper bag in his hand and the water jug at his feet, watching it go. Rusty came down from the block of limestone, walked across the rubble field, and sat on his boot. Holt looked down at the cat. The cat looked up at him. "Yeah," Holt said quietly. "I know." For 17 days, Holt worked the lot from dawn until the light failed. He cleared the weeds. He stacked the rubble into sorted piles by size. He learned which of the fallen limestone blocks he could move alone and which he could not. His hands cracked and bled and then began to callous. His face went brown along the cheekbones and the bridge of his nose where the small pale scar caught the sun. He lost weight he could not afford to lose and gained a slow, visible strength in his forearms that came from the work. Winona Harkness brought him water and food every other day and never stayed long. She did not ask personal questions. She did not push. Once she came with a man in his early 70s, weathered and lean with carpenter's hands, and a quiet way of moving, and she introduced him as Jasper Wexler, a retired Finnish carpenter from 2 roads over whose wife Carol had passed 2 years back and who had been building too many birdhouses since. "Jasper," she said, "can teach you to frame a wall if you decide you want to build something here." Jasper Wexler looked around the rubble field. He looked up at the stone tower. He looked at Holt's hands and at the small, careful piles of sorted stone. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was low and dry. "I knew your grandfather," he said. Holt stopped breathing. Jasper did not look at him. He looked up at the tower. "Not well. I was a boy. He was a good man. The town didn't treat him right." He paused. "I'd be glad to help you build something here, son, if you'll have me." He held out his hand. Holt took it. On the 17th morning, Holt was prying a section of fallen iron strapwork off the eastern edge of the foundation pad when he noticed that Rusty had stopped following the sun. The cat had been with him all morning, moving from sunny block to sunny block, the way cats do in early autumn. But for the last hour, Rusty had been sitting in one specific spot at the center of the concrete pad. He sat upright, his tail curled neatly around his front paws, his gold-amber eyes fixed on a particular section of concrete between two of the rusted anchor bolts. He had not moved in 40 minutes. The M on his forehead caught the sun. The notched left ear was flicked forward in attention. Holt walked over. "What are you looking at?" Rusty did not move. He lifted one small white paw and patted the concrete once very deliberately. Then he put the paw back down and resumed sitting. Holt knelt. He brushed dust away with the side of his hand. He ran his palm across the concrete, and he felt it. A seam, not a crack. A seam, a deliberate line where two sections of concrete had been poured separately with a thin gap between them, sealed with something dark and old tar perhaps, or roofing pitch. The sealant had cracked in places. The seam ran in a perfect rectangle, 4 feet long by 3 feet wide. He knocked on the concrete with his knuckle. The right side answered solid, the left side answered hollow. Holt sat back on his heels. The wind moved through the broken arches of the tower above him. A barn owl called once from somewhere in the lantern room. Rusty rose silently, walked to Holt's hip, and pressed his small, warm side against him. A century-and-a-half old hollow, in a foundation that nobody in 65 years had thought to look at twice. Holt put his hand flat on the seam and he closed his eyes for a long moment, and he listened to the wind across the cornfields and the sound of his own heart and the small, steady purr of the cat against his side. "All right," he said quietly. "All right then." He got up to go borrow a pry bar from Winona Harkness. Winona Harkness did not ask him what he needed the pry bar for. She watched him cross the threshold of the hardware store with his dark green canvas jacket, buttoned against the morning chill, and the small pale scar across the bridge of his nose catching the light from the front window. And she looked at his hands and at the way he held himself, and she went to the back wall and took down a 4-foot iron bar with a hooked end and a flat tongue at the other. She set it on the counter between them. She did not bother to ring it up. "Bring it back when you're done," she said. "I will." And Holt. She paused with her palm flat on the counter. Her pale blue eyes held him for a beat. "Whatever you find out there, you come tell me. You don't have to, but you can." He nodded once. He did not trust his voice. He walked back out into Main Street with the pry bar resting along his shoulder, and Rusty fell in behind him at the curb, the M on the cat's forehead bright in the morning sun. The notched left ear flicked forward at every sound. The walk back to the lot took 20 minutes. Holt did not hurry. He used the time to think about all the things a hollow under a foundation could be. A storage chamber for the original construction crew, a buried cistern from before there was town water, the forgotten remnant of a prohibition still, an animal den that had collapsed and been paved over. He did not let himself think the other thing. He did not let himself think it until he was kneeling on the concrete pad again, with the pry bar in his hands and the seam in front of him, and the wind moving across the broken arches of the tower above. And even then he only thought at once very quietly, the way you whisper a prayer you do not expect anyone to answer. "Please let it be something." Then he set the flat tongue of the bar into the seam, and he leaned his full weight against it. The old sealant cracked with a small dry sound. He worked the bar in another quarter-inch. He levered. The bar bit. Somewhere deep in the seam, with a sound like the cracking of a walnut, something gave. He worked for 2 hours. The concrete panel came up piece by piece. It was 4 inches thick, dense and well poured, the kind of work done by hands that meant it to last. He had to brace the bar against the rusted anchor bolts and use both arms and his shoulder to lever each section free. Twice he sat back on his heels because his arms had gone to water. Both times Rusty came and pressed against his hip and waited until he was ready again. When the opening was finally wide enough to see down through, the morning had crossed into early afternoon, and Holt was sweating through the cotton of his Henley, despite the cool of the day, and the small pale scar across the bridge of his nose was bright and tight with effort. He leaned over the dark hole and looked. A chamber, 6 feet deep, 4 feet across, lined with poured concrete walls that were dry and clean and uncracked. Whoever had built it had known what they were doing. There was no leak, no water stain, no sign of the 65 years that had passed above it. The air that came up from the chamber smelled cold and mineral, like the inside of a well in autumn. And at the bottom, resting on the dry concrete floor, was a wooden box wrapped in dark oilcloth and tied with twine that had gone the color of old straw. Holt's hands were shaking when he reached for the rope they had been using to brace the pry bar. He tied a slip loop. He lowered himself down into the chamber, hand over hand, the cold of the concrete walls pressing against his back. He stood on the floor of the chamber, and the top of the opening was a foot above his head. He looked up. Against the rectangle of the sky framed by the broken edge of the foundation, the orange shape of Rusty appeared leaning over the opening, with his ears forward and the M on his forehead in silhouette. Holt picked up the box. It was heavier than he had expected, the way old things made by hands are always heavier than you think. He passed the rope through the twine and made it fast, and then he climbed out of the chamber the way he had come down, and he stood on the concrete pad with the box at his feet, and his breathing loud in his ears and the wind moving across the broken tower above him. He did not open it there. He did not know why. He picked the box up, and he carried it under the tarp at his sleeping spot, and he sat down cross-legged on the ground with it on his lap, and he took out his pocket knife, and he cut the twine. The oilcloth fell away in soft black folds. Underneath was a box of dark walnut, dovetailed at the corners, smooth and well-finished and exactly the size of a milk crate. There was no lock. There was a small brass hinge on the back and a simple latch on the front. Holt lifted the lid. 4 things lay inside it, packed with the careful order of a man who meant whoever opened the box to understand that nothing in it was an accident. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft and dark, the corners frayed. A stack of photographs wrapped in wax paper tied with a thin black ribbon. A thick bundle of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon, the edges yellowed. And a sealed envelope, yellowed at the corners, the wax of the seal a dried blood red. The handwriting across the front in long, careful strokes that he had now seen so often in his life, that the shape of those letters was a thing he knew before he knew the words. To whoever carries the Hartwell name forward. Holt set the envelope down on his knee. He did not open it. He picked up the journal first. The leather was cracked along the spine, but the binding still held. He opened it carefully, the paper stiff and brittle, but intact. The first entry was dated April 12, 1955, and it began, "Started work today on the rebuild of the municipal water system. The council voted 6-1 to approve the project, and Mayor Atwood shook my hand and said the town has been waiting 20 years for a tower that does not leak. I told him we'd have a new pump house by fall and a restored crown on the tower by spring. My name is Hayward Hartwell. I am 32 years old. I am the new water commissioner of Colton, Iowa. I am working on the same tower my grandfather Ezekiel rebuilt the brickwork on in 1935, on the same foundation my great-grandfather Josiah laid with his own hands in 1887. 4 generations of Hartwells have looked up at this tower. I intend the 5th to see it standing too." Holt read the entry twice. He read it the way you read a sentence in a language you used to know as a child but have not spoken in 15 years. The shape of the words on the page felt impossible. Hayward Hartwell, Water Commissioner, 4 generations. The 5th. He turned the page. The next entries were quiet. Hayward Hartwell wrote in a careful hand about pipe layouts and pump capacities, about training a young assistant, about the satisfaction of designing a system that gave clean water to a town that had been drawing it from bad wells since before he was born. He wrote about his wife Ellen, who brought him lunch at the worksite on Saturdays. He wrote about their daughter who had been born late in his life and whose name, when Holt turned the page and found it, stopped his breath. Cecily turned 4 today. Ellen made her a cake with strawberry frosting from berries she picked off the back fence. Cecily got it everywhere in her hair, on the dog, on my Good Sunday shirt. I do not care. She is the best thing I have ever helped to make. Cecily. His mother's name. Holt put his hand flat on the page to steady himself. The wind moved across the tarp. Rusty had come up beside him and was now sitting against his hip with the M on his forehead pressed against the cotton of his Henley. He stayed there. His mother had died when Holt was 4 years old. A car accident on a wet highway in Ohio. He could not remember her face. He could remember the smell of her shampoo and the sound of her voice humming something in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, and that was all he had of her. And now there were these words on a yellow page, written by a man he had never met, calling her the best thing he had ever helped to make. He turned the photographs out of the wax paper next with hands that no longer felt entirely steady. The first showed a young man in work clothes standing in front of a half-built section of stone, grinning at the camera with a measuring chain over his shoulder. He was tall, lean, with dark hair cut short, and a jaw that Holt recognized the way you recognize your own face in a mirror at an unexpected angle. The young man stood on the foundation of the tower. Behind him, the limestone walls climbed 20 feet into a clear Iowa sky. The photograph was dated in the same long, careful handwriting. On the back, Hayward Hartwell, age 32, restoration of the crown, August 1955. The next photograph was Hayward and a woman with kind eyes and light hair standing on a porch. Then Hayward holding a baby. Then a little girl of 5 or 6 sitting on a tractor, her hair in 2 short braids, gap-toothed and grinning, with a man's hand resting protectively on the small of her back. Cecily, Holt's mother. He laid the photographs out on the ground in front of him, in the order they had been packed, and he looked at them for a long time. And the wind moved across the broken tower above him, and Rusty pressed his small, warm side against his hip without moving, and the September light slanted across the rubble field in long copper bars. He had a grandfather. The grandfather had lived here. The grandfather had built here. The grandfather had sealed a box of his life into the foundation of his own tower and had marked the envelope on top of it with a phrase that did not pick a name because he did not know what the name would be. To whoever carries the Hartwell name forward. Holt picked up the journal again and he kept reading. The first years were good. Hayward Hartwell rebuilt the upper third of the stone tower in 1956 and 1957, brought in the original blueprints from a local historical society, brought in a third-generation stonecutter from Davenport for the most delicate of the spirework. He wrote about the satisfaction of seeing the lantern room restored to its 1887 design. He wrote about Cecily learning to read on his lap by the wood stove in the kitchen. He wrote in a sentence Holt had to read 3 times about teaching her the names of the 4 generations of Hartwells who had stood on that ground before her. She knows them in order now. Josiah, who broke the prairie. Ezekiel, who held the land through the dust. Me, who put the crown back on the tower. And whoever comes next when it's her turn to say. Then the tone of the journal changed. It began slowly. An entry in late 1959 about a man named Thaddeus Buckman who had bought a tract of farmland east of town and wanted to subdivide it for development. Then an entry about Buckman approaching the council to propose private investment in the municipal water system in exchange for development rights to the supply. Then an entry in language going sharper and handwriting pressed harder into the page. Thaddeus Buckman does not want to improve the system. He wants to own it. He wants the water of this town to flow through his hands the way the deeds of this town's farmland already do. I told the council so at last night's meeting. 3 of them listened. 3 of them looked at the check Buckman was waving and pretended they did not understand what I had said. The entries grew darker. Rumors, anonymous letters to the county paper, a petition for an audit of the water commissioner's books. Holt read about an audit that found nothing wrong, every receipt accounted for every dollar in its place, and he read about the way the damage was done anyway. 3 council members who had supported Hayward changed their votes. In March of 1961, the council voted 4-3 to eliminate the position of water commissioner and create a new one in its place under a different title, with a different scope, and a different man, a man Buckman had personally recommended was appointed to it. They did not fire me for cause, Hayward wrote. They abolished the chair I sat in. Same job, different name, different person. Everyone in this town knows what happened. Everyone in this town will pretend they do not. That is how it goes. The next entries were written in quick succession over several days, the handwriting urgent, now the lines uneven on the page. Hayward described the building of the chamber, mixing the concrete at night after the town had gone dark, with only Ellen and the hired stonecutter from Davenport to help him. Pouring the walls, waterproofing the interior, placing a wooden box dovetailed at the corners made of dark walnut from a tree he had felled on his father's old farm. Sealing the lid of the chamber with concrete laid in 2 pours with a seam of tar between them so that no one looking at the foundation would see anything but a join in the original construction. Covering the seam with rubble. Backfilling around the perimeter. Watching the work disappear under a thin layer of gravel and dust until even he by morning could not tell exactly where it had been. If they take everything else from us, they cannot take what is buried in the thing I built with my own hands. Inside that thing my grandfather Josiah built first. On the ground my great-grandfather broke with his hands in 1887. The land does not forget. The water does not forget. Whoever opens that box one day will know what we were. 2 weeks later, the last Colton entry, 3 short lines. We are leaving in the morning, Ellen and Cecily and me. The truck is packed. Cecily is 8 years old, and she does not understand, and she will not forgive me. I will live with that for the rest of my life. Holt closed the journal. He sat for a long time under the tarp with the photograph spread on the ground in front of him, and the sealed envelope still unopened on his knee, and the journal in his lap, and the September wind moved across the broken tower and the cornfields beyond. And somewhere a long way off, a tractor was making a slow, patient sound in a field, and Rusty did not move from his hip, and Holt did not cry. He did not cry because the shape of the thing he was looking at was too large for crying. He had spent 20 years believing he came from nothing. He had spent 2 years sleeping in cars and shelters and walking away from pawn shops with a watch in his pocket he did not understand why he was keeping. He had been wrong about all of it. He had not come from nothing. He had come from 4 generations on this exact piece of ground, and the man who had written this journal had sat where he was sitting now and known there would be someone after him and had written it down so that someone would know. He picked up the bundle of papers tied in the faded blue ribbon. He did not know yet what they were. He untied the ribbon. He unfolded the top sheet. It was a United States Savings Bond Series E, dated June 1956. Face value $100. Issued in the name of Hayward Hartwell. The next was the same. Dated October 1956. Face value $50. Then 1957. Then 1958. Then 1960 and a face value of $500, the largest he had seen yet. Then 1961, the year Hayward had left Colton. Then more bonds purchased from Missouri and from Kansas from rented rooms and motels, the man saving $50 and $100 at a time, year after year, through Ellen's illness, and Cecily's leaving home through decades of work as a maintenance man and a pipe fitter and a school custodian. 16 bonds in all. Holt did not know exactly what matured savings bonds were worth. He knew that they grew. He knew these had been sitting for 65 years and longer. He tied the ribbon around them again with hands that were no longer steady. He had not opened the envelope. He carried the box, the journal, the photographs, and the bundle of bonds back into town the next morning. He went to Winona Harkness's hardware store first. He set them on the counter in front of her without speaking, and he opened the journal to the first page, and he pointed to the name Hayward Hartwell and the date April 12, 1955, and Winona Harkness took her reading glasses off the chain around her neck and put them on and read again and sat down slowly on the stool behind the counter and did not speak for a long time. When she looked up, her pale blue eyes were wet. "My father knew him," she said. Her voice came out hoarse. "My father said he was the best thing that ever happened to this town's water system. Said when they ran him out, it took 2 men to do the job he had done alone. Said the new one did not know what he was doing, and the pipe started failing within the year." She paused. "My father said Hayward Hartwell was the most honest man in Colton." She closed the journal carefully. She rested her hand on top of it. "I need to take you to see Imogen," she said. The county clerk's office was 3 blocks away. Imogen Cassidy was already at the counter when they walked in, as though she had known they were coming. She did not look surprised when Winona set the journal in front of her. She did not look surprised when Winona opened it to the first page. She did look at Holt for a long, quiet moment with her pale gray eyes, and she said very softly, "He was my father's friend." Holt did not speak. "My father was on the council that voted to eliminate his position." She held his gaze. "My father changed his vote at the last minute. He was one of the 3 who voted to keep your grandfather. He lost his place on the council the following year because of it. He said until the day he died, it was the only vote he was proud of." She walked to the file cabinet against the back wall. She pulled out a folder marked Town Records Water Commission 1955 to 1961. She set it on the counter and opened it. The minutes from March 1961 were on top. The motion to restructure the Water Commission, sponsored by council members Pruitt, Dawson, and Buckman. "Thaddeus Buckman," Holt said quietly. "His grandson is Crawford Buckman." Imogen's voice had gone flat. "Runs the biggest land development company in 3 counties now. Lives in a glass house out on Route 12. Drives a black SUV." Holt looked at the page. He looked at the name on the page. He thought of the smile of the auctioneer when he had read the description of Lot 14. "He doesn't know about this lot yet," Holt said. It was a question. "He will," Imogen said. He brought the bonds to the First National Bank that same afternoon. The teller who took them was a young man who looked at them, looked at Holt, and excused himself to get his manager. The manager was a woman of about 50 named Bernice Porter, who wore her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head and who did not waste time with surprise. She walked Holt back to her office and closed the door and laid the bonds on her desk one by one, smoothing each yellowed paper flat with the side of her hand. "These are Series E," she said, "issued between 1956 and 1972. They've all reached final maturity." She opened a drawer and took out a calculator and a printed maturity table, and she began entering numbers, checking face values, multiplying by maturity factors, totaling sums in a column on a yellow legal pad. The pencil moved steadily. The room was quiet except for the small click of the calculator keys. Holt sat in the chair across from her with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes on a spot on the far wall. He counted his own breathing. He kept counting it. Bernice Porter set down the pencil. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. "Yes, ma'am. The combined matured value of these 16 bonds is $52,341. The number did not register. He heard it the way you hear a word in a language you do not speak. He heard the sounds, but the sounds did not connect to the room he was sitting in. "I'm sorry," he said. "Could you? $52,341. He gripped the arms of the chair. The chair did not move. The desk did not move. The room remained the same room. The bonds remained on the desk, yellowed and small and 16 in number. The numbers Bernice Porter had written on the yellow legal pad did not change. After a moment he could speak. His voice came out without any inflection at all. "2 weeks," he said. "About that. I can advance you a small portion today against the first bond, as a courtesy. The rest will follow when the paperwork clears." He nodded. He walked out of the First National Bank into the late afternoon. Winona Harkness had loaned him the use of her truck for the errand. He climbed into the driver's seat, and he sat for a long time without starting the engine. He looked through the windshield at the brick storefronts of Main Street and the small brick post office and the diner with the hand-painted sign that said Rosie's and the late afternoon light slanting across the bricks in long copper bars. And he thought of his grandmother Opal in her cleaning uniform in the building they had lived in, eating peanut butter on saltines so he would have enough for school lunch. He thought of his mother whose face he could not remember. He thought of a man he had never met saving $50 at a time out of a maintenance worker's pay for 65 years. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, and his shoulders shook once, and a single slow tear ran down the side of his nose into the collar of his Henley, and that was all he allowed himself. Then he sat up. He started the engine. He drove back to Winona's hardware store and returned the keys, and he walked the 3/4 of a mile to the lot with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the long pale silhouette of the broken tower against the sky. Rusty came out from under the tarp when he arrived and pressed against his shins until Holt sat down on the concrete pad. "So that's it," Holt said quietly to the cat. His voice was steady again. "That's what he left." The black SUV arrived the next afternoon. Holt was on the rubble field stacking limestone blocks when he heard the engine on Tower Road, smooth and expensive, the wrong sound for the road. He set the block down. He turned. The vehicle pulled through the open gate and stopped 20 feet from him. The engine cut. A man stepped out. He was in his late 40s, gray at the temples, the thick, steady build of someone who had been athletic in his youth and had carried enough of it forward to still look formidable in a charcoal half-zip and good jeans. He looked around the lot with the practiced gaze of a man who valued land. He took in the cleared lines along the fence, the sorted piles of stone, the half-built workbench Jasper Wexler had brought over the day before, the tarp under which Holt had been sleeping. His eyes settled on Holt last. "You're the one who bought it," the man said. "I am. Crawford Buckman." He did not offer a hand. He took a business card from his shirt pocket and held it out. Holt did not take it. Buckman set it on the nearest limestone block. "Buckman Development. We've been holding this parcel in our long-range planning for 2 years. The county was supposed to retain it for commercial rezoning under the 2024 master plan. The auction listing was an error. The clerk says it wasn't." Something flickered in Buckman's face, not anger, something cooler than anger. I'm filing a formal challenge with the county board next week. I'll be honest with you, son. I don't want to make trouble. But this parcel is part of a plan that's been in motion since before you walked into town. You'd save yourself a lot of difficulty by selling it back to me at a fair price now. Rusty appeared on the half-built workbench. He sat down on the top board with his front paws together and his gold-amber eyes fixed on Bushman, and the M on his forehead caught the light, and the notched left ear flicked forward, and he did not move, and he did not look away. Buckman's gaze went briefly to the cat, then back to Holt. "What's a fair price?" Holt said. 20,000, today. We can sign the paperwork in my office this afternoon. For a half acre I paid $5 for. For a half acre you cannot legally develop. You have no utility hookups, no septic. You cannot live on this land. You cannot build on this land without permits. We will block. 20,000 is a generous offer for a piece of rubble. It's not rubble. Bookman looked at him, looked up the long pale shaft of the broken tower above them. Look back. It's rubble, son. With history, history is not worth $20,000 to anyone but a fool. I am offering you 20 because I am being decent. Take the offer. No, sir. It was the calm in his own voice that surprised Holt. He had expected to be afraid. He was not afraid. He was very tired and very clear. Buckman looked at him a long moment. The cat on the workbench did not move. "You should think hard about what you're doing here," Buckman said finally. "These things go easier when both sides are reasonable." He got back into the SUV. He pulled away in a small, careful arc, the dust of Tower Road rising behind the tires, and Holt and Rusty stood together on the rubble field and watched the taillights disappear toward the highway. Holt picked up the business card. He turned it over in his fingers. He put it in the inside pocket of his canvas jacket against the small olive tin that held his great-great-grandfather's pocket watch. "So this is what it looks like," he said to the cat. "The other side of it." The damage came 3 nights later. He did not see it happen. He had walked into town for water from Winona's outdoor spigot, which she let him use after hours, and when he came back along Tower Road in the dark, Rusty came running up the road toward him from the lot, the M on his forehead bright in the moonlight, his tail straight up, making a low, repeated sound Holt had not heard him make before. Holt broke into a run. The tarp had been cut from its anchors. The half-built workbench Jasper had brought over was kicked in on one side. The piles of sorted limestone were scattered, and across the framing of the small wall, they had begun to raise on the eastern edge of the foundation, in white spray paint, 2 feet high, were the words, "Go home." Holt stood in front of the framing with his water jug in his hand, and he looked at the white paint dripping down the studs, and he set the jug down very carefully on the ground, and he sat down on a limestone block, and he put his head in his hands. Rusty came across the rubble field and pressed against his side. He sat there a long time. He thought about leaving. He thought about the $57 in his pocket, and the bonds that would not clear for another week, and the black SUV, and the smile on the auctioneer's face, and the way the woman in the green vest had crossed herself when he had bid on the lot. He thought about Hayward Hartwell leaving Colton at 38 years old, with a sick wife and an 8-year-old daughter and a truck packed in the dark. He took out his phone, which Winona had loaned him a charger for, and he scrolled to the number for Jasper Wexler. It was 2 in the morning. The old man picked up on the second ring. He did not sound as though he had been asleep. "Holt." "Yeah." "What is it, son?" Holt swallowed. He looked at the white letters dripping down the wall studs. "I think I might need help," he said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Jasper Wexler's voice came back low and dry and absolutely steady. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." The truck rolled in at 2:15. Jasper got out without a word. He walked around the framing once. He looked at the spray paint. He looked at the cut tarp. He looked at the scattered limestone. He walked back to the truck, opened the toolbox in the bed, and took out a cordless work light and a paint scraper. "We're not sleeping tonight," he said. "No, sir." They worked through the rest of the dark. Jasper showed him how to take the spray paint down off the studs with mineral spirits and a stiff brush. They re-anchored the tarp. They reset the framing. By the time the sun came up over the cornfields, the wall studs were clean again. The workbench was righted, and Jasper had made a pot of coffee on his camp stove and was sitting on a limestone block with his hands wrapped around a metal cup. "You want to know who did it," he said. "I think I know who paid for it." "Probably." Jasper took a slow sip. "You can't prove it. He knows that." Holt sat down across from him. Rusty climbed up between them and sat with his M-marked head against Jasper's knee. "What do I do?" Holt said. The old man was quiet for a long time. He looked across the rubble field at the broken tower against the dawn sky. He looked at Holt's hands, calloused now, the cuffs of the dark green jacket stained with paint thinner and limestone dust. "You finish reading the journal," he said, "and then you and I are going to talk to Imogen about everything that's in it, and then we are going to figure out what your grandfather actually left for you. Because Hayward Hartwell did not seal a chamber under a tower for 16 savings bonds, son. He sealed it for the truth." He set down his coffee. "You sleep a couple hours. I'll watch the property." Holt slept under the tarp with Rusty curled into the crook of his neck. And when he woke at mid-morning, Jasper was still sitting on the same limestone block with a long carpenter's hammer across his knees and a thermos of fresh coffee at his elbow. The 5th day after the spray paint, Imogen Cassidy came to the lot herself. She came in her own car, an old gray sedan, and she carried a manila folder under her arm. She did not stop to look at the tower. She walked straight across the rubble field to where Holt was sitting on the foundation pad with the journal open on his knee, and she sat down beside him without ceremony, and she opened the folder. Inside was a single yellowed letter, single page, typed on an electric typewriter, dated April 1985. "I went looking through the old correspondence files at the office," Imogen said, "after what Winona told me, after I read the journal entries you brought in. I knew there was something I'd seen once years ago when I first started in that office, and I couldn't quite place it. It took me 3 days to find it." She slid the letter across to him. It was addressed to the town council of Colton, Iowa. It was signed by a woman named Opal Hartwell. Holt's hand went still on the journal. "My grandmother," he said. Yes, he picked up the letter. The text was short, 4 paragraphs. In careful, formal language, Opal Hartwell wrote that she was the wife of the late Robert Hartwell, son of Hayward Hartwell, and that she was writing on behalf of her family to inquire about the status of a half-acre lot on the eastern edge of Colton, formerly the site of the Hartwell Stone Tower. She wrote that she understood the lot had reverted to county ownership at some point following her father-in-law's departure in 1961. She wrote that her late husband had wished before his death to inquire about the possibility of repurchase. She wrote that she would be grateful for any information the council could provide. The letter had been received. There was a date stamp. There was no record of a reply. "She knew," Holt said quietly. "She knew. She knew the whole time." He turned the letter over. The back was blank. He turned it back to the front. He looked at the date again. 1985. He would not be born for another 21 years. His mother, Cecily, had been 30 years old that spring somewhere in Ohio, already estranged from Hayward for over a decade. Still 25 years away from the wet highway and the wrong weather that would take her life at the age of 55. His grandmother had known. She had known about Colton. She had known about the tower. She had known about Hayward, and she had said nothing. For all those years in the third-floor walk-up and the cleaning uniform in the hospital at the end, she had said nothing. Holt sat for a long time with the letter on his knee. "I'm not angry," he said finally. He said it to himself, but Imogen heard it and answered. "No." She had her reasons. "I don't know what they were. I would like to, but I'm not angry." Imogen looked at him a long moment. Her pale gray eyes were quiet. "Your grandmother was protecting somebody," she said. "I don't know who. Maybe your grandfather. Maybe your mother. Maybe you. Maybe all 3. But she was protecting someone." She paused. People in this country don't always tell their grandchildren what their grandchildren need to know. They tell them what they think will let them sleep at night. Sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes they aren't. She stood up. Finish the journal, Holt. There's more in it than you've read. He did finish it. He'd read the back third of it that night under his tarp with Rusty curled on his lap and Jasper's truck idling on the road as a watch. He read entries he had not gotten to yet written in a shaky hand, decades after the front of the journal, after Hayward's wife Ellen had died, after Cecily had left home at 17, and never written after Hayward had spent years in rented rooms in Missouri trying to find his daughter and failing. He read the entry from June 2010. A woman from the state of Ohio called me today, Mrs. Kessler. She said my daughter Cecily died on a wet road in March of this year. She said Cecily had a son, a little boy, 4 years old. His name is Holt. He is in the foster care system. Cecily had listed me as next of kin on a hospital form when he was born. That is how they found me. I asked Mrs. Kessler if I could take him. She said there would be an evaluation. I am 82 years old. I have a heart that the doctors do not like. I live in one room in a boarding house in Springfield. I do not have a car of my own. I told her I would do whatever it took. I will see him. I do not know when. I will see him. Holt put the journal down on his chest. He looked up through the gap in the tarp at the sky over Iowa. The grandfather had tried. The grandfather had not just remembered him. The grandfather had tried. Holt lay there until the moon set, and then he turned the page. There was one more entry on the next page dated 3 weeks later. 3 lines. The state denied my petition. They said I was too old, too sick, too poor. They said Holt would be placed in qualified foster care and given a stable environment. I told them I am his grandfather. They said that was not enough. He closed the journal. He had not cried in 2 days. He did not cry now. He lay on his back under the tarp with the journal on his chest and his eyes open at the sky, and Rusty pressed against the side of his throat with the M on his forehead against his jaw. And somewhere in the dark, a barn owl called once from inside the lantern room of the broken stone tower above them. In the morning, he found one more thing. The journal had ended. The back inside cover was blank, but folded into the rear pocket of the leather binding tucked so flat he had not noticed it. On the first 3 readings was a single sheet of newsprint, yellowed, brittle. He took it out carefully. It was a clipping from the Colton Register, dated October 8, 2012, a short article in the local section. An unidentified man was found deceased in his vehicle on Route 30, approximately 40 miles west of Colton on Tuesday afternoon. The Cherokee County coroner has determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest. The vehicle, a 1991 Ford pickup, was registered to a Hayward R. Hartwell of Springfield, Missouri. The deceased is believed to be the registered owner. Personal effects in the vehicle included a sealed envelope addressed to whoever carries the Hartwell name forward. No next of kin has been located. Remains were processed by the county medical examiner's office. Holt sat for a very long time with the clipping in his hand. 40 miles. The man had driven from Missouri at 84 years old with a bad heart and a packed envelope, and had made it to within 40 miles of Colton, and his heart had given out on him on Route 30 on the same stretch of highway, where 14 years later a Honda Civic would die on the shoulder, and a young man with $5 in his pocket would step out and start walking. The grandfather had been coming home. The grandfather had made it 40 miles short of Colton on the return, but he had made it far enough. He had reached Colton first. He had done what he came to do. He had turned back for Missouri only after. Holt folded the clipping carefully and put it back in the rear pocket of the journal. He stood up. He brushed the dust off his jeans. He looked across the rubble field at the broken tower and at the small orange shape of Rusty sitting on the foundation pad in the morning sun, and at the sealed envelope he had not yet opened, still resting on the wooden box at the foot of the tarp. He did not open it. Not yet. There was one more thing to find first. He did not know how he knew that. He only knew that Hayward Hartwell had not built one chamber under one tower across one lifetime to leave only 16 savings bonds in a journal. The bonds were enough to start. The journal was enough to know. But the land was the thing. The land was what Josiah had broken in 1887, and Ezekiel had held through the dust of 1935, and Hayward had defended in 1961. Whatever was here, the largest of it, was still under the ground. Holt looked at Rusty. The cat returned his gaze, the M on his forehead bright in the morning sun, the notched left ear flicked forward. "Where's the rest of it?" Holt said quietly. The cat blinked once. Then he stood up, stretched, and walked with the unhurried sureness of a creature that had been waiting for the question toward the storm cellar at the back corner of the lot. The storm cellar at the back corner of the lot was older than the tower. Holt had walked past it 100 times in the last 3 weeks without giving it a second look. It sat in the northwest corner of the property, half sunk into a small natural rise of ground, its entrance covered by a pair of heavy wooden doors gone gray with weather. The doors had been chained shut for as long as anyone in Colton could remember. Winona Harkness had told him the second week that the cellar predated the tower itself, that Josiah Hartwell had dug it into the prairie sod the first summer he homesteaded the land in 1885, 2 years before the first stone of the tower was laid. Winona had said it the way people in farm country say things about old buildings, with a kind of careful respect. "The cellar's older than any of us, son. Older than the church. Older than the bank." Holt had nodded at the time and gone back to his work. The cellar had been chained for 90 years. Whatever was in it was bats and field mice and rotted shelving. He had bigger problems. He had been wrong about that. He followed Rusty across the rubble field that morning with the journal still in his hand and the September sun climbing slow over the cornfields. The cat moved without hurry, the way the cat moved when he had decided. He went directly to the storm cellar doors. He sat down in front of them. He looked up at Holt. The M on his forehead was bright in the sun. "Show me," Holt said quietly to the cat. Jasper Wexler came over from his truck with a pair of bolt cutters and a battery-powered work light. He looked at the doors. He looked at the cat. He did not ask questions. He cut the rusted chain in 2 clean snips, and the lock dropped onto the dirt with a small, dead sound. The doors did not want to open. The hinges had been seized for decades. Jasper and Holt worked them together, prying and lifting, and finally hauling the left door up and back so that it folded against the rise of ground behind it. A breath of cold mineral air came up out of the dark below. A stone staircase, 6 steps, descended into a chamber lined with limestone block. Jasper went down first with the work light. Holt followed. Rusty stayed at the top of the stairs and watched. The cellar was larger than Holt had expected. 12 feet by 15 with a low arched ceiling of fitted stone, the walls dressed in the same pale limestone as the tower above. The floor was hard-packed earth. A pair of rotted wooden shelves lined the east wall. A broken whiskey crock sat in the corner. Jasper's work light swept the room and found nothing else. Holt stood in the middle of the cellar and turned a slow circle. "It's just a cellar," he said. Jasper did not answer. He was looking at the west wall. He stepped closer to it. He put the work light close to the stones. "Holt," he said quietly. Holt came over. Jasper was running his fingertips along the seams between blocks. Most of the joints were tight-fitted clean, the work of a man who had known stone. But on the western wall, about 3 feet from the corner, in a section 8 stones wide and 4 stones tall, the mortar was a different color. A slightly warmer gray. A slightly different texture. The blocks themselves were the same limestone. They had been fitted carefully, but they had been fitted later. Decades later by another set of hands. Jasper knocked on the wall with his knuckle. The stones answered hollow. "There we are," he said. It took them most of the afternoon to take down the false wall. The blocks were dry set, no mortar holding them in place. Only the careful weight of stone on stone. The way a man might build a wall he expected to want to take down someday. Jasper had brought a rubber mallet from his truck. They worked the blocks free, one course at a time, starting at the top, laying each stone on the dirt floor in the order they had come out. The blocks were heavy. Holt sweated through his Henley. The small, pale scar across the bridge of his nose burned. Rusty came halfway down the stairs and watched from the third step. The notched left ear flicked forward, his gold-amber eyes catching the worklight each time it turned his way. When the last stone came out, they stood for a moment without speaking. A second chamber lay behind the false wall. It was smaller than the cellar, perhaps 8 feet by 10, the same vaulted ceiling, the same fitted limestone. The air inside was dry and cold and had not been breathed by anyone alive in 100 years. At the center of the chamber, on a low stone shelf cut into the back wall, sat a wooden box. It was larger than the box Holt had pulled from the foundation, made of oak, not walnut. Banded in iron at the corners, the iron gone black with age. On the front of the box, pressed into the wood with a hot brand, was a single mark, a capital H inside a circle. The Hartwell brand. Holt did not move for a long minute. Then he stepped forward and lifted the box from the shelf with both hands. It was heavier than the walnut box had been. Heavier the way old things made by hands are always heavier than you expect. He carried it up out of the second chamber and up the stone stairs and out into the September afternoon, and he set it down on the foundation pad of the tower in the same place he had been sitting when he opened the first box, and he sat down in front of it, cross-legged the way he had sat in front of the first. Rusty climbed up onto the limestone block beside him. Jasper stood 3 paces back with his hands in his jacket pockets and did not crowd him. The latch on the oak box was a simple iron hook. Holt worked it free. He lifted the lid. A scent of cedar came up from inside. Someone had lined the box a long time ago with thin sheets of red cedar. Cedar will keep paper for 2 centuries if you let it. Inside lay 3 things. A long document folded in thirds on heavy parchment paper, the color of old ivory, sealed in a flat red wax seal that bore the same H in a circle as the box. A small leather-wrapped bundle that contained, when he unwrapped it carefully, 2 more folded letters. Smaller, on lighter paper, tied together with a thin black ribbon. And in the back of the box, lying flat against the cedar lining, a single photograph in a small wooden frame. He did not look at the photograph yet. He could not. He picked up the parchment document first. The wax seal broke under his thumb with a small dry crack. He unfolded the parchment. The first thing he saw was the eagle. A great federal eagle pressed into the top of the page in dark ink, its wings spread a scroll in its talons. Below the eagle, in the heavy formal type of the late 19th century, the page read, "The United States of America, Homestead Patent. Know ye that whereas the claim of Josiah Hartwell of Cherokee County in the state of Iowa has been confirmed in accordance with the Homestead Act of 1862 as amended, and below that the metes and bounds of the claim, 40 acres of prairie, a surveyor's coordinates, a boundary line, and at the bottom of the page in a hand that was not the typewriter's in faded brown iron gall ink that had bitten into the parchment more than a century before Grover Cleveland. President of the United States of America. The signature of a President of the United States. Dated July 17, 1887. Holt sat for a long minute without moving. 40 acres. He had been told the lot was a half acre. The auction listing had said a half acre. The county records had shown a half acre. The fence around him enclosed a half acre. This document said 40 acres. He turned the parchment over slowly. On the back, in another hand, and another ink in a careful script that was clearly Josiah Hartwell's, were the words, "The land bounded by this patent shall pass undivided to my heirs forever. Should any portion be lost to debt or to deceit, my descendants are charged before God to recover it. The land knows our blood. Do not let the deeds tell you what is yours." Holt set the parchment down on his knee. Jasper. Jasper came forward. He looked at the parchment. He looked at the boundary description on the front and the inscription on the back. He sat down on a limestone block. He took off his cap and ran his hand across the back of his neck. 40 acres, he said quietly. That's most of the east side of Colton. How? How what? How did it become a half acre? Jasper looked at him for a long moment. He put his cap back on. Son, he said, I think we're about to find out. Holt picked up the two letters tied with the black ribbon next. The first was on lighter paper than the parchment. The handwriting was Josiah Hartwell's, the same hand that had signed the back of the patent. The letter was dated August 14th, 1887. To whatever child of mine reads this in a time I cannot see, I broke this prairie with my hands in a borrowed plow in the spring of 1885. My wife Mehetabel and I came west from Pennsylvania with one wagon and a saddle horse and a Bible. The first winter we lived in a sod dugout I cut into the bank where the cellar now stands. We lost a child that winter. We did not lose the land. This summer the patent has come through from Washington. The land is ours under the law. But the law is a thin thing. The law moves with money. The law forgets. I have seen good men lose what they broke with their own bodies because a banker in the East drew a line on a paper. Therefore, I have built a chamber under this cellar to hold a patent in these words. I have built it of stone laid dry that a man with patience can take it down and put it up again. I have closed it with a wall of stone the same as the rest. I have told no one but my wife. If you are reading this, you are blood of my blood. Know that the land knows our name. The dust on this prairie has heard us called across it. The water under this ground has tasted our hands. The wind has carried our voices to the horizon for as long as we have been here. Hold the land. If they take it back. By law, if you can. By the work of your hands, if you cannot. Do not let strangers tell you what is yours. Josiah Hartwell, August 1887. Holt folded the letter slowly. He set it down on the parchment. The second letter was on heavier paper. The handwriting was older, shakier. The date was September 1935. To my grandson or great-grandson, whoever shall come to this place after me. My name is Ezekiel Hartwell. I am the only living son of Josiah Hartwell. I have farmed this land through 42 summers. This year the wind has not stopped. The black dust comes from the south and the west and covers everything. My wife Mariah died in March of the dust pneumonia. My son Hayward is 12 years old and stands at the window every evening watching for rain that does not come. The bank in Cherokee Falls has offered me money for 40 acres. They say the land will not come back. They say the dust has killed it. I am letting go of 39.5 acres of the patent to keep the half acre with the tower on it and the cellar and the house. I am signing the papers tomorrow. My father will turn in his grave. I have walked the back of the property tonight and asked his forgiveness. I am leaving this letter sealed with my father's where he left it. I am adding to it the receipts of the sale and a copy of the new deed that shows the half acre that remains. Should this land ever come back into our family, my grandchildren must know what was lost and how. Should it never come back, they must know that we held what we could. The land remembers what the deeds forget. Ezekiel Hartwell, September 1935. Holt looked up at Jasper. He could not speak. Jasper Wexler took off his cap again. He sat with it in his hands. He looked across the rubble field at the broken stone tower against the September sky. 39.5 acres, he said softly. Dust Bowl. The bank took it for 60 cents on the dollar. Standard story of that decade in this part of Iowa. He paused. But Holt, listen to me. The Buckman family bought their original land tract in 1936 from a bank in Cherokee Falls. I'd lay you any money you want, son, that the land Buckman development sits on now is the same 39.5 acres your great-grandfather sold to keep your great-great-grandfather's tower. Holt put his hand flat on Ezekiel's letter. He sat for a long time. Above him, the tower rose pale and broken into the sky. Around him, the rubble of his great-great-grandfather's stonework lay sorted into piles. At his hip, the cat sat with the M on his forehead, bright in the sun. In his hand, the letter of a man who had stood on the same ground 91 years ago and asked his own father's forgiveness for letting go of what he could not hold. The land remembers what the deeds forget. He looked at the framed photograph last. It was small, maybe 4 inches by 6. The wooden frame was hand-carved from the same red cedar that lined the box. The photograph itself was a black and white image faded to brown at the edges, the kind of careful posed image a country photographer might take in the 1880s. It showed a young man and a young woman standing in front of a sod dugout cut into a rise of prairie. The man wore a work shirt and suspenders. He held a rifle loosely in his right hand. He had a dark beard and steady eyes and a strong jaw. The woman beside him wore a long dark dress and a white apron. Her hand rested on a small wooden cradle set in the grass at her feet. In the cradle, wrapped in a white blanket, was a baby too young to focus its eyes on the camera. On the bottom edge of the photograph, in faded brown ink in a hand, Holt now knew, as well as his own, Josiah and Mehetabel Hartwell. Cherokee County, Iowa. Summer 1886. Our son Ezekiel, 3 months old. Holt held the photograph for a long time. 5 generations of his blood looked out of that picture or had been written into the letter beneath it. The faces of 2 of them he was seeing for the first time in his life. The third Ezekiel was the baby in the cradle. The fourth, Hayward, had not yet been born. The fifth, his mother Cecily, was still 70 years away from being born when this photograph was taken. He himself was 120 years from existing. But here they all were, looking at him. He set the photograph down on the foundation pad. He looked across the rubble field at Jasper Wexler, who was still sitting on the limestone block with his cap in his hands. Jasper. Yes, son. Why is Crawford Buckman trying to take this lot? Jasper looked at him a long moment. $20,000 for a half acre of stone rubble, he said, and his grandfather's family already owns the 39.5 acres around it. You tell me what that man wants. Holt looked up at the broken tower above them. It's not the land, he said slowly. He already has the land. No, son. Then what? Jasper put his cap back on. He stood up. He brushed the dust off his jeans. I think so, he said. We need to make a phone call to that paralegal Imogen's been telling us about. Her sister's girl. The one finishing law school in Des Moines. The paralegal's name was Riley Cohen. She was 22 years old, Imogen Cassidy's grandniece on her sister's side in her final semester of a paralegal certification program at Drake, while working in a property and water rights firm 3 blocks from the state capitol. Imogen called her that evening from the hardware store landline with Winona and Holt and Jasper standing around the counter, and Riley drove the 2 hours from Des Moines the next morning. She arrived at the lot in a dusty green Subaru with a stack of folders on the passenger seat and a thermos of coffee in her hand. She was a small, dark-haired young woman in a flannel shirt and jeans, with steel-framed glasses pushed up on her head, and the watchful, quick eyes of someone who had been the smartest person in every room she had ever entered and had stopped bothering to hide it. She looked at the parchment. She looked at Josiah's letter. She looked at Ezekiel's letter. She read each of them twice. She did not speak for the first 10 minutes. When she did speak, she said one word. Aquifer. Holt looked at her. Aquifer, Riley said again. She set the parchment down. Holt, listen to me. I work for a water rights firm in Des Moines. Iowa is sitting on top of one of the largest freshwater aquifer systems in the continental United States. The Dakota Aquifer runs under the western half of the state. The Jordan Aquifer runs under the eastern half. There is a smaller system called the Silurian Devonian that runs in a narrow band right through Cherokee County. She pulled a folder out of her stack. She opened it. She spread 3 maps on the foundation pad. My firm has been tracking a confidential well survey application filed 2 years ago by a company called Continental Springs Beverage Group. It's based in Chicago. They make premium bottled water. They've been quietly surveying Cherokee County for 2 years. Their internal documents, which my firm has, because we represent a competing landowner up the road, show they identified one specific site as the highest yield artesian well in the county. One specific half-acre where the Silurian Devonian aquifer comes within 60 feet of the surface, and where a deep well drilled in 1956 already accessed the source. She looked at Holt. The 1956 well is the well your grandfather drilled when he was water commissioner. The well that feeds the original tower. The well that is on this lot. She tapped the map. Continental Springs has a draft contract sitting in a file in Chicago ready to sign. The contract is with Buckmon Development. It assigns Buckmon the surface rights and Continental Springs the water rights for 99 years on this exact half acre. The contract value is $14,200,000. The September wind moved across the rubble field. Holt did not move for a long time. 14 million, he said. 200,000. For my half acre. For the water under your half acre. He looked at Jasper. Jasper looked back at him. That, Jasper said quietly, is why he offered you 20,000. Riley folded the maps. She tucked them back into the folder. She turned the folder so it was facing Holt. There are 3 things you need to know, she said. First, the well on this lot was drilled and capped under a 1956 municipal permit issued to your grandfather. The water rights to that well were never transferred. They are still by Iowa statute attached to whoever owns the surface parcel. Right now, that is you. Second, the contract Continental Springs has drafted with Buckman is contingent on Buckman holding clean title to this parcel. Right now, he does not hold any title to this parcel. You do. Third, she paused. She looked at him over the steel rims of her glasses. Continental Springs does not actually care which Hartwell or which Buckman or which random 20-year-old they sign with. They care about the water. If we move fast and if you want to, you can be on the other side of that table by the end of the month. Holt looked at her. Then he looked at the tower. Then he looked at Rusty, who had come up onto the foundation pad and was sitting on Ezekiel Hartwell's 1935 letter with the M on his forehead, lined up exactly over the words, "The land remembers what the deeds forget." Holt did not say anything for a long time. "I don't want to sell the water," he said finally. Riley looked at him. "I want to keep it for the town," he said. Like he did. The county board hearing was set for the second Tuesday of November. Crawford Bookman's lawyer filed his formal challenge to the auction sale the following week, citing the same obscure provision in the 2024 master plan about commercial overlays in surplus listing procedures. Imogen and Riley filed a counterbrief on Holt's behalf. The brief was 43 pages long. It included photocopies of the 1887 patent, both of the buried letters Hayward Hartwell's water commissioner appointment from 1955, the 1961 council minutes that had eliminated his position in the 1956 municipal well permit. The afternoon before the hearing, Crawford Buckman came to the lot one last time. He came alone. He drove the black SUV through the open gate and parked it 20 feet from the foundation pad as he had the first time, but he did not get out right away. He sat in the driver's seat for nearly a minute with his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the broken stone tower above the rubble field. When he finally got out, he did not have a business card. He did not have a lawyer with him. He walked across the rubble field with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he stopped 6 feet from where Holt was sitting on a limestone block with the leather journal open on his knee, and he stood there for a long moment without speaking. Rusty was on the workbench 3 paces to Holt's left. The cat did not get up. He did not run. He sat with his front paws together and his gold amber eyes fixed on Buckman, and the M on his forehead caught the afternoon sun, and the notched left ear flicked forward and held. Buckman did not look at the cat. "I want to tell you a story," he said. "May I sit down?" Holt closed the journal. He gestured at the limestone block across from him. Crawford Bookman sat. He looked older up close than he had the first time. The gray at his temples had spread some. The skin under his eyes had the bruised look of a man who was not sleeping well. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped between them, and he looked down at the rubble for a long time before he spoke. My grandfather, Thaddeus Buckman, drank himself to death in 1981, he said. He was 68 years old. The doctor said it was cirrhosis. The doctor said it was 20 years of bourbon at a level no liver could survive. The doctor said a lot of things. He paused. What they did not say, because they did not know, was that my grandfather had not slept through the night since the spring of 1961. Holt did not move. My father told me when I was old enough what happened on the Colton Council in March of 1961. He told me what my grandfather did to your grandfather. He told me what it cost a good man and his family. He told me he could remember being a boy of 10 and watching his own father, my grandfather, sit at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning with a glass in his hand, looking at a photograph of the Hartwell Tower that he had cut out of the newspaper. Just sitting there, just looking at it. Crawford Buckman looked up. I have lived in the shadow of what my grandfather did, son. I have lived in it my entire life. I built Buchman Development on the land he bought from your great-grandfather in 1936 at the bottom of the Dust Bowl. I have made a great deal of money on that land. I have a son who is 9 years old. He will grow up to inherit that company. He will inherit with it what my grandfather did to make it possible. He paused. When I heard a Hartwell had walked into the Colton auction and bought back the half-acre with the tower, I thought I was being given a chance to take the last thing my grandfather had not finished taking. I thought I could buy a cheap sign with Continental and never have to think about Hayward Hartwell or his daughter or his grandson again. I thought I could clear the books before my son was old enough to ask any questions. He looked at Holt for a long moment. I was wrong. He stood up slowly. I am withdrawing the challenge to your auction sale tomorrow morning. My lawyer will file the paperwork before the hearing convenes. I am not asking you for forgiveness. Forgiveness is not something you owe me. He paused. I am not your friend, Holt Hartwell. I do not know if I ever will be, but I am not going to be the third generation of Buckmans to take from the Hartwells. That ends today. He looked up at the broken tower above them. My grandfather looked at a photograph of that tower every night for the last 20 years of his life. I think I understand now what he was looking at. He walked back to the SUV. He did not say goodbye. He got in. He started the engine. He turned the SUV in a careful, slow arc and drove back down Tower Road toward the highway, and the dust of his tires rose into the September light and settled, and Rusty did not move from the workbench until the sound of the engine had gone all the way out of hearing. The hearing the next morning was the shortest county board meeting Colton had seen in 20 years. Crawford Buchman's lawyer rose and stated that his client was withdrawing the challenge. The board chair, a woman in her late 50s named Dr. Patricia Webb, accepted the withdrawal. She turned to the public comment portion of the agenda. She asked if anyone wished to address the board on the matter of Lot 14. Winona Harkness stood up. So did Jasper Wexler. So did Imogen Cassidy, who as county clerk did not normally speak from the public floor. So did Dave Perkins, the plumber who had run the water line. So did Hank from the lumberyard. So did the woman in the green vest from the auction who had crossed herself the first time. So did Riley Cohen on Holt's behalf with the 43-page brief on the table in front of her, although she did not need any of it. Holt sat in the front row with the leather journal in his lap and the small olive tin pressed against his ribs and the dark green jacket of his grandmother's husband buttoned to the second button. The small pale scar across the bridge of his nose caught the fluorescent light of the meeting room. Rusty was outside on the courthouse steps with Riley's sweater wrapped around him on a folding chair, with one of the courthouse custodians watching him on his lunch break, because the custodian had once had an orange Tom that looked, he said, exactly like that one. The board voted 5-0 to affirm the auction sale. Dr. Webb gabbled the meeting closed. The crowd in the room did not cheer. Colton was not the kind of town that cheered in a board meeting. But several people came up to Holt in the slow, careful way of country people offering their respect and shook his hand. Winona Harkness held his hand a beat longer than the others. Imogen Cassidy did not shake his hand. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Jasper Wexler did not say anything at all. He just nodded. That afternoon, Holt signed a non-binding letter of intent with Continental Springs Beverage Group through Riley's firm. The letter stipulated that the Silurian Devonian aquifer water beneath Lot 14 would not be sold to any commercial bottler. It stipulated that the well would remain available for any municipal use Colton might require in the future. It stipulated that Holt Hartwell, as the surface owner, would hold the water rights in trust for the township in perpetuity with no personal profit to himself beyond a modest annual stewardship fee. Continental Springs withdrew their well survey application the following week. The contract with Buckman Development was never signed. The $14,200,000 went back where it had come from. Holt kept his $52,341 in matured savings bonds. He used part of it to build a small house and a workshop on the lot. The lumber came 2 weeks later. Holt was working at the foundation pad with Jasper when the flatbed delivery truck pulled through the open gate. The driver had a clipboard. Holt walked over to him. "Lumber order," the driver said. 24 sheets of plywood, 42 studs, a pallet of asphalt shingles, a pallet of concrete bag, paid in full. "I didn't order this." "Order is in your name. Got the address right here." "Who paid for it?" The driver looked at his clipboard. "Slip says anonymous, sir." Holt looked at the truck. He looked at the lumber. He walked around to the tailgate. In small black letters on the corner of the gate, under a smear of dust, was the logo of Buckman Development. Holt stood there for a long moment with his hand on the tailgate. Then he nodded once. "All right," he said quietly. "All right then." They built through the rest of November and into the first cold of December. Jasper Wexler taught Holt to frame a wall, to set a rafter, to plumb a post with a level. The house was small, 12 by 20 feet. One room with a sleeping loft above the kitchen area, a wood stove against the north wall, a bathroom that Jasper plumbed himself over a weekend that he said nearly killed him. The workshop they built directly on the foundation pad of the tower using the cleaned limestone blocks from the rubble field as a low knee wall, the upper structure framed in lumber and roofed in corrugated metal. The lantern room of the tower, still hanging 120 feet in the air above them, became the roof's most expensive ornament. Holt did not have the money to restore the spire, and he did not try. He left the tower as it was, broken at the top, whole at the base. A pair of stone hands raised palm to palm against the Iowa sky. The workshop was open to anyone who wanted to come and learn or work or fix something they could not afford to take to a paid shop. Winona donated tools. Jasper taught Saturday carpentry classes. Riley drove up from Des Moines on weekends and worked through the legal paperwork to formally establish the workshop as a small nonprofit under the name Hartwell Family Trust. By Christmas, the workshop had a coffee pot, a tool wall, a small pellet stove for heat, and a hand-lettered sign over the door that Jasper had carved, and that read in plain block letters, "The land remembers what the deeds forget." Crawford Buckman came once to the workshop in February with his 9-year-old son. The boy's name was Mitchell. Mitchell wanted to build a birdhouse. Jasper Wexler walked him to the third workbench from the left and handed him a piece of pre-cut pine and a small finishing hammer without comment. Mitchell tapped nails into wood with great seriousness for 45 minutes. Crawford stood 3 paces back with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched his son, and did not look at Holt, and did not look at the tower above them. And he held himself the way a man holds himself when he is trying very hard not to weep in a place where weeping would be inconvenient. When the birdhouse was done, Mitchell carried it across the workshop to show his father. Crawford crouched down and looked at it. He told his son it was good work. He told his son that the boy who had taught him to build it, and he gestured at Holt without looking at him, knew what he was doing. He stood up. He looked finally at Holt. He nodded once. Holt nodded back. That was the last word, if you could call a nod a word, that the two of them needed to exchange. Crawford brought Mitchell to the workshop 3 more times that spring. He never stayed past the carpentry class. He never asked for anything. He never made a speech. He paid for 2 new workbenches one Saturday by leaving a check on Winona's counter at the hardware store with a note that said simply, "For the Hartwell Workshop." Butchman. The check was for $5,000. Holt cashed it and used it to buy a generator and a bandsaw. On a Saturday in March, with the snow just gone and the workshop full of people learning to build, Holt looked up from his workbench to see a young woman standing at the gate. She was 17, maybe 18. She had a black trash bag in one hand and a hooded sweatshirt that was 3 sizes too large pulled around her shoulders. Her sneakers were separating from the uppers at the toes. Her hair had not been washed in some days. She did not come through the gate. She stood there evaluating the way people evaluate new places when they have learned that new places are usually worse than the last place. Holt set down his pencil. He walked across the workshop and out into the spring sun. He stopped at a distance she could close or not close depending on what she wanted. "Can I help you?" he said. "I saw a sign on the highway." Her voice was thin and careful. She did not meet his eyes. "Said the workshop was open." "It is." She looked at the duffel of her own life in her hand. She looked at the sign Jasper had carved over the door. She looked for a long moment at the broken stone tower above the workshop, at the way it caught the spring light and threw it back pale across the rubble. "I don't have anywhere," she said. The words came out flat, not asking for anything, just stating a fact the way you state the weather. Rusty came out from under the workshop bench where he had been sleeping. He walked across the gravel to where the young woman stood at the gate. He sat down on her left foot on top of the separating sneaker with the M on his forehead pressed against her ankle, and he looked up at her without blinking. She looked down at him. For the first time, her face moved. Not a smile, just a small loosening the way a fist loosens when it has been clenched too long. "What's your name?" Holt said. "Dara." She swallowed. "Dara Lindgren." "Holt Hartwell." He paused. "There's a spare room in the house. It's small. It has a bed. The stove keeps the place warm. The bathroom has hot water." He paused again. "Come in if you want." Dara Lindgren looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the cat on her foot. She looked at the workshop, at the people inside it bent over their workbenches at the warm light coming out through the open door. She stepped through the gate. Rusty rose and walked beside her ankle as she came across the gravel. The M on his forehead bright in the March sun, the notched left ear flicked forward, and Holt stepped back to let her pass, and he did not say anything else. 2 weeks after Dara moved in on an evening when the workshop was empty, and Jasper had gone home and the wood stove was filling the small house with the warm, dry heat of late winter, Holt was cleaning out the base of the workshop wall to install a pegboard when he found something behind the limestone. It had been wedged into a narrow crack behind the original knee wall, the wall he and Jasper had built from the clean stones of the fallen tower. Someone had pushed it into the seam between two of those old blocks a long time ago, and when Holt and Jasper had reset the stones for the workshop's foundation, they had built a new wall right over the old crack without ever noticing what was inside it. Only now, cleaning out the cavity to install a pegboard, had Holt reached far enough into the seam to feel the corner of the paper against his fingertip. He drew it out carefully, a small flat envelope no larger than a postcard with no address on the front. The envelope was not old. The paper was newer than the parchment, but the handwriting on the front, when he turned it over, was a handwriting he now knew as well as his own. The long, careful strokes of a man who had learned penmanship in a one-room schoolhouse in the 1920s. The envelope read in Hayward Hartwell's hand, "Last thing, for Holt." Holt sat down on the workshop floor. Rusty came across the concrete and pressed against his hip and did not move. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Color, slightly faded. The kind of color photograph that came out of a drugstore one-hour machine in 2010. It showed a state-run group facility, a linoleum hallway, a folding chair. An old man in a brown corduroy jacket sat on the chair with both hands resting on his knees. He was thin. He was bald at the crown with silver hair around the sides. He had the same jaw that Holt saw in the mirror every morning. He was holding the hand of a small boy. The boy was 4 years old. He had dark hair and dark hazel green eyes, and a small pale mark across the bridge of his nose where he had not yet taken a fall on a fire escape stair. He wore a striped shirt that was too big for him. He held the old man's hand without smiling. He was looking up at the old man's face. The old man was looking down at the boy. He was not smiling either. His eyes had a brightness that did not have to do with smiling. It had to do with the thing he was looking at. On the back of the photograph, in the same long, careful handwriting, Holt Hartwell, my grandson, age 4. They would not let me bring him home, but I held his hand for 10 minutes. Mrs. Kessler took this picture before they walked him back inside. I drove 11 hours to Colton after this was taken. I placed this photograph in the seam of a fallen block near the foundation chamber. My chest is too weak now to break the concrete open again. This will have to be enough. Tomorrow I turn back for Springfield. If God is kind, I will make it. If he is not, some Hartwell will find this stone someday. Hayward Hartwell, Colton, Iowa, October 7, 2012. Holt sat on the workshop floor for a long time. He held the photograph in both hands and he looked at the face of the 4-year-old he could not remember being holding the hand of the 84-year-old he could not remember meeting. And the moment that the photograph showed had been entirely lost to him and entirely held by his grandfather, all the way from a state facility in Ohio to a rented room in Missouri to a fallen block of limestone in Iowa, tucked into a seam in the stone against the weather, and the years for the boy who would not arrive for another 14 years to come looking. The grandfather had not just tried, the grandfather had succeeded. For 10 minutes on a Tuesday in October of 2012, an old man and a small boy had held hands in a hallway in Ohio, and the small boy had not remembered it, and the old man had carried it the rest of his life and into the seam of a stone at the foot of a broken tower in Iowa, so that 14 years later the small boy could find it and know. The boy had been held. The boy had been wanted. The boy had never been the boy nobody wanted. Holt set the photograph down on the workshop floor in front of him. He put his hands flat on either side of it. He bowed his head. He cried then for the first time since his grandmother had died. He cried the way men cry who have spent 20 years learning not to. Quiet shaking without sound, with his shoulders bent and his hair falling forward across his forehead. Rusty climbed onto his lap and pressed the M on his forehead into the wet of Holt's hand, and Holt put his arms around the cat and held him there, and the wood stove ticked in the next room over, and the wind moved across the cornfields outside, and the broken stone tower above them stood as it had stood for 139 years, and nothing in the world moved except the small, steady purr of the cat against Holt's chest. After a long time, Holt stood up. He carried the photograph into the small house. He took down the framed picture above the wood stove that had been an old print of an Iowa landscape Winona had given him as a housewarming gift. He took the photograph of Hayward and 4-year-old Holt out of its envelope, and he set it carefully into the frame in the place where the landscape had been, and he hung it back on the wall above the wood stove. He stood looking at it for a long minute. Then he picked up Hayward Hartwell's journal from the small table by the wood stove. He opened it to the inside of the front cover, where in handwriting now 65 years old were written the words, Hayward Hartwell, Water Commissioner, Colton, Iowa, April 1955. Below that line, in the spring of 1962, before he had left Springfield for the last time, Hayward had added a second line in shakier ink, Hayward Hartwell, last of his line at Colton. September 2012. Holt picked up a pencil. He wrote a third line in his own hand below the others, Holt Hartwell Workshop, Colton, Iowa. March 2026. He closed the journal. He set it back on the table. He walked out onto the porch of the small house and sat down on the step. Dara was in the workshop across the yard finishing the cabinet door she had been working on after her shift at the diner. The light from the workshop spilled gold across the gravel. Rusty came out of the house and sat on the step beside him with his tail curled around his front paws and the M on his forehead bright in the porch light. Above them, the broken stone tower rose into the Iowa night. It had been there 139 years. The land it stood on had been Hartwell land for 141. That Holt thought was the thing about stone. Stone did not stop being a family's just because the deeds changed hands. The dust remembered the boots that broke it. The wind remembered the names called across the fields. The water under the ground remembered the well that had drawn from it. The deeds passed through county hands 1,000 times, and the land kept its own quiet count. And the count did not change because a council voted, or a banker drew a line, or a stranger paid 60 cents on the dollar for 40 acres in 1936. The Hartwell Stone Tower had been waiting for him for 139 years without knowing his name. His great-great-grandfather had laid the first stone of it in the summer of 1887 and had sealed a letter under it for whoever would come. His great-grandfather had given up 39.5 acres around it in 1935 to keep it standing. His grandfather had restored its crown in 1956 and lost it to the same family that had taken the rest. His mother had been born under its shadow and had died on a wet road in Ohio without ever knowing it was hers. His grandmother had carried the secret of it across 50 years and 1,000 miles and into a third-floor walk-up where she had raised him on a cleaning wage and pressed a dented olive tin into his hand the week before she died and told him not to sell what was inside. He had not sold it. He had spent his last $5 on a tower his great-great-grandfather built in 1887 in a town he had never heard of, and he had pulled a journal from a chamber under its foundation, and a homestead patent signed by President Cleveland, and letters from men who had been dead a century, and a photograph of his own 4-year-old hand held in the hand of a grandfather he could not remember meeting, and the water of a town that had once driven his blood out of it, and the slow, careful trust of a community that had been waiting 65 years to make something right. Holt Hartwell was 20 years old and homeless. He had $5 to his name, and he spent it on a fallen stone tower his great-great-grandfather built in 1887. It was the best $5 he ever spent. Rusty pressed against his hip with the M on his forehead against his side, and Holt sat on the porch step in the spring night, and in the workshop across the yard, Dara Lindgren was sanding the edge of a cabinet door her own hands had built. And above them, the broken stone tower rose pale and complete and unfinished into the stars over Iowa, and the wind moved across the cornfields and across the rubble field, and across the names of the 4 generations of Hartwells who had come before him on this ground, and it did not forget a single one of them.